So I'm going to talk through some of the processes involved in communication, what we need to do to be able to both understand and produce speech, because it's hugely complex, and then to relate what we know about that to stammering. This is a communication chain. The right hand side in blue is the expression side, so that's what we're doing when we're speaking. And the left hand side in green, the comprehension side, that's what we're doing when we're listening and understanding. And both those sides are equally important. When we communicate with someone, we tend to take it in turns. I talk while you listen, then you talk while I listen, and on we go. And of course, in a group, anybody might get the turn. But communication does require both those sides to be working well. The first thing we have to do when we want to say something is decide what we want to say. So we have an idea in our brain of the thing we'd like to express. And in order to do that, we have to select the right words. In our brain, we all have a vocabulary store, and that's like a library of words, all the words we've ever learned. And they're stored a bit like you would store books in a library. So words are stored with their sound properties, what the word starts with, how long it is, how many syllables it's got, what it rhymes with. And they're also stored with what we call their semantic properties. That's to do with the meaning of the word. So what kind of thing is it? What category does it belong to? What does it look like? How might we use it? Where might we find it? And so on. So if we think of those semantic properties as being like the category in the library, and the sound properties as being like the way we alphabetize books in order to find them, that's how we would retrieve words from our vocabulary store. We go to the right category and we think about the sound properties and we select it. And let me give you an example of how that works. So I'm going to say something and I'm confident you'll be able to predict the word I'm going to use. I went to the zoo and I saw an L. Hopefully you're all thinking elephant right now, because your brain was already working through lists of things you might find in a zoo. So that was the category bit, the meaning bit. And then when I gave you that little clue of L, that beginning sound, you were working out all the words that could fit that also began with that sound. Hopefully came up with elephant. It's possible you might have said elk, not as likely. Or even something like elevator. Could fit, but again, not as likely. So that's how our brain retrieves words. And the more properties we know about a word, the more aspects of the meaning and the sound properties that we have associated with that word, the more easily we can retrieve it when we need it. So in young children, if they've only just learnt a new word, they might struggle to use that word when they want to, because they haven't yet got a lot of information associated with it, so it's not quite as easy to retrieve. Once we've got our words ready to go, then we put the words together into a sentence, and that bit's really tricky, because when we talk in sentences, the sentence has to be in the right order, it has to be grammatical, it has to be meaningful, it has to make sense to our listener, and it has to be clear. So learning to put words into sentences is a really complex part of language development, and it's often at that stage that parents might notice that children start to stammer a little bit when they get to that stage of starting to combine words together. And the reason it's so difficult to do that is because when we talk in sentences, we have to select the sounds to make up that sentence. We do that at sentence level, not at word level, by which I mean we don't break the words up, do we? So we don't talk like that. We string those words together into a continuous, unbroken string of sounds. That's incredibly hard for our brain to coordinate. If you couldn't understand the language I'm speaking right now, and I said to you, the cat sat on the mat, you would have no way of knowing that I've just used several short words, because there's no gap between the words at all to give you that clue. I might well have been using a long word like hippopotamuses. So that's why when we're listening to a language we don't understand, it's very hard to pick out the words we might understand, because they're buried amongst that string of sounds. And when we're using all of those complex sounds, our brain is having to coordinate that, and that's incredibly tricky. So we have to coordinate our breathing, because it's the out-breath that powers the movement of our vocal cords here in our voice box, and we have to then shape the airflow in such a way that we make individual sounds. And we're moving over 100 little muscles when we do that. So this little video, which is an MRI scan of somebody talking, I think illustrates really well how complex and how rapid that process is. So if you look at the tongue here, and the tongue is a lot bigger than you might imagine, it goes all the way down to just above our chin, you'll see that it moves incredibly rapidly. Sometimes the tongue tip is going up behind your teeth when we might be making something like a t or a s sound, or it might be going up at the back for making something like a k or a g, or you might see the tongue coming slightly between the teeth for something like a th sound. And you'll notice that it's moving constantly. The other bit to notice is this little part here. That's known as our uvula, and it acts a little bit like a gate. So sometimes you'll see it's up when it's in that position. The airflow is directed through our mouth. When it's more down, the airflow can go up and around and come out of our nose. And when we're talking, the airflow is constantly being redirected, because some sounds come out as an oral airstream like ah and s and p. Others come down our nose. They're known as nasal sounds, things like and n, and also ng. Also, while we're talking, we tend to take a little in-breath every now and then through our nose. So if you watch that uvula, you'll see it's constantly moving up and down. We're not conscious of that while we're talking, but our brain is working really hard to do all of that.
Speech production is possibly the most complex of human behaviours. In 1 second of fluent speech, we can produce approximately 5 or 6 syllables comprising 10 to 12 phonemes and a variety of articulatory gestures. This requires coordinating dozens of muscles, from the diaphragm and ribcage used to provide the source of sound as air passes through the larynx, to the tongue, lips, and jaw used with precision to shape the chambers of the vocal tract.
So as you can see, it's incredibly complex, it's incredibly rapid. So especially for young children, it's really hard for their brain to coordinate all of that. And they often get it wrong. And they'll say things back to front like caterpillar instead of caterpillar. But even as adults who are pretty practiced with our speech, we do still make those sound errors some of the time, especially when we're a bit stressed. So the next thing is that we're doing all of that and we're trying to say those sounds and words and sentences smoothly. So that's what we call speaking fluently. That means the words flow out in a smooth way. That's obviously the bit that can be a bit more difficult for people who stammer. Sometimes their words don't flow out completely smoothly. There might be some repetitions of sounds. They might stretch the sounds a bit, or sometimes they might just get completely stuck and the sound doesn't come out at all for a little while. And it's all to do with the way the brain is wired. In people who stammer, their brain is wired subtly differently. So all of that complex communication that's going on in the brain to make those sounds come out is a little bit more difficult. for a person who stammers, and the message sometimes doesn't quite get through as rapidly as it needs to. And when we say rapid, we're talking about milliseconds actually, so it is incredibly rapid. So you might get what feels like a little glitch or a hiccup in the brain, and that results in this thing we call stammering. Something else that we have to learn to do when we're communicating is to speak appropriately. What that means is we tailor the way we talk to the situation we're in and to the person we're talking to. So young children starting in nursery or school soon learn that you don't talk to your teacher in quite the same way as you talk to your mum or brother or friend. And, you know, in our lives, we have different ways of talking to people depending on our relationship with that person. And then what we tend to do when we said something is we do this thing called self-monitoring. So we listen back to what we've said and we check whether it sounded okay, did we make any errors, and as I said, we sometimes do. We might say something like, oh, I left my car in the park arc. Oh, I mean the car park. And sometimes we don't notice that we've made that error and we carry on anyway. In young children, that ability to self-monitor starts to develop typically between about 3 and 6. It varies from person to person. Some children will be very aware of the way they speak, and therefore when they start to stammer, it might bother them or upset them because their self-monitoring system is making them aware that the sounds aren't quite coming out as they would like them to. Other children appear to be blissfully unaware and just barrel on anyway. So probably they haven't quite yet developed that ability to self-monitor. So that's the speaking side, but the listening and comprehension side is equally complex and equally important. So let's look at the things involved in that. So when somebody's talking to us, in order for us to understand what they're saying, we have to attend to what they're saying. And attention and listening is something that young children can find quite difficult, so we need to make sure we've got their attention. Looking really helps with that because it enables us to interpret the non-verbal aspects of communication. So NVC, or non-verbal communication, is far more important than the verbal side. Actually, we gain most of our understanding through things other than the words. So facial expression, gestures, body language, the context, all of those things help us to understand as well as the words somebody's using. And children rely very heavily on those non-verbal aspects to help with their understanding. Obviously, we have to have sufficient hearing. If we've got a hearing impairment, it's going to be difficult to hear and therefore to understand, but it's also going to be difficult to learn to make the sounds we need for speech because children tend to hear and copy. That's how they learn. But you can have perfect hearing and not be very good at listening, and it's not just children who struggle with that sometimes. Memory is a big part of understanding. When somebody says something to us, especially if it's quite a long thing, what we have to do is hold that sentence in our auditory memory for long enough for our brain to make sense of it. And in children, their auditory memory span is quite short, so quite naturally we don't give young children big, long, complex instructions, because if we did, by the time we get to the end, they've forgotten what we said at the beginning, or they're so busy holding on to the first thing that they can no longer concentrate on what we say at the end. So it's really helpful with young children if we chunk information down into manageable chunks. They'll be able to understand it a lot more easily. Obviously, we have to understand the words people are using. This comes back to our vocabulary store. So if a child has got that word in their vocabulary store, they'll hopefully understand it when you use it. But if you're using very sophisticated, complicated vocabulary, they might well struggle to understand because they haven't yet got that word. They don't know what it means. But you can understand the words and not understand the sentence, because sentence structure can be really complicated. So to give you an example, most 3-year-old children, for example, should be able to understand the sentence, the boy is pushing the girl. That's a fairly bog standard kind of sentence that we might use. But if we turn that round and give it what we call a passive structure, the boy is being pushed by the girl. A lot of 3-year-olds would struggle to understand that because they're still hearing boy, push, girl. So they haven't understood that more complex sentence structure, even though they have understood the words. And even as adults, we experience that sometimes. Perhaps when we're reading, we get to the end of a sentence and we think, oh, what? I'm not sure what that means, and we have to go back and reread. And it's not that we haven't understood the words, it's just the sentence itself is very complicated. It seems really obvious to say we have to understand the meaning, but we use ridiculous expressions like, it's raining cats and dogs. I mean, what does that actually mean? Or we say to children things like, come on, pull your socks up. Or we use things like sarcasm. If it is raining cats and dogs, I might well look out of the window and say, oh, another lovely day. So the meaning can sometimes completely contradict the actual words we're using, so that makes it difficult again. And some children in particular will really struggle to understand that non-literal language. It will make it hard for them. And the point is that if you're struggling to understand what's being said to you, you will then struggle to formulate your own response, because this chain goes round and round. So once you've said something to a child, they then have to respond. And if they can't understand or they're struggling to respond, it's going to be difficult for them. How that relates to stammering is if we add anything at all into this mix, which puts an extra little bit of load on the brain, something breaks down. And the thing that breaks down is always this bit, the speak fluently bit. So the fluency of speech goes out of the window when we get overwhelmed or overloaded. And that happens to all of us to a certain extent. If I were feeling very anxious, well, then, I might, I might well speak a bit more like this. Now, obviously that was a bit exaggerated, but I'm sure you'll recognise that experience of losing that ability to speak smoothly and feeling like you're umming and erring more. We often throw in empty words, what we might call fillers, things like and you know, and we're just trying to give our brain that bit more time to get the words out. So that happens to all of us. In young children, their fluency is very fragile. In young children who stammer, their fluency is extremely fragile and it breaks down quite easily. So if we add in a strong emotion, for example, such as excitement, or anxiety, or frustration, that starts to overload the brain a bit, and that might well be one of the things that causes fluency to break down. Other things that can do that are feeling rushed, or put on the spot, or feeling as if everybody's attention is on you. Being tired or under the weather are other things that will cause the brain to struggle. As I've already said, struggling to understand what someone else is saying to you could be one of the things that makes the fluency break down when you then try and respond. So if we can simplify the language we use with small children, it will really help them. If we can give them plenty of time, it will really help them. If we can not bombard them with too many questions, it can really help them. So as you can see, the process of communication is incredibly complex. It's probably the most complex thing we have to learn as humans. And therefore it's probably not surprising that many young children, typically between the ages of 3 and 6, will go through a phase where they do appear to be stammering. Some of those will continue to stammer, some will stop. The vast majority will stop, actually. But we have no accurate way of predicting which children will and which children won't continue to stammer. So the best thing we can do while children are stammering is to support their communication and take as much pressure off as we can and just give them plenty of time to speak and get their words out. As children get older and their motor skills improve, their coordination skills improve, their language skills improve, then what we often notice is that the stammering starts to diminish because they're better able to cope with all of those pressures and demands without losing fluency.